So we're about to go into chapter 5. You may have noticed something different here, is that now that I'm doing these things ahead of time. Right now, it is a week from the actual beginning of the technical semester, next Wednesday. And we've been informed that they're closing the campus on Fridays to do the cleaning. So I will not be in the lab on Fridays with any reliable regularity. I may dash in to do stuff with the animals, because I am still allowed to do that, but I'm no longer accessible by phone in the lab. You can still send me emails. I still look at my emails then, and these other times, I'll be here just by email, right? Is the idea that people might walk into the building masked and come to a room to talk, just seem to, I don't know, make their heads explode or something. I don't understand the decisions that are being made. They make zero sense to me. This actually isn't that unusual for people. Genetics is confusing, and this is actually something that does happen where somebody in the family just doesn't seem to fit trait-wise to the other ones, and they go, I hear you failed genetics, son. But genetics is a very, very complex subject. It's so complex that we're going to introduce it in this semester as kind of a big picture item. And then we're going to come back to it the second semester and look at the molecular basis. And even then, virtually everybody who's going to be a science major is going to take a genetics course that will be a prerequisite for pretty much everything else that you do in most places. It's a complicated subject, and it's getting more complicated all the time, because I can't keep up with a lot of the stuff. And I've gone to the National Institute of Health and been trained in DNA analysis, and it still confuses me a lot of the time. Let me just see if I can't get that slightly better focused. So we're gonna, as we've done before, take a historical view. I'm gonna kind of walk you through some historical discoveries about genetics, talk quite a bit about this guy, who, I don't know if there's any pictures of him. This is probably an artist representation. I don't know if there are actually images that survive. But this is Gregor Mendel. And there's his name. I was going to write it down, but there it is. Now, some of the story I'm going to tell you is speculation based on what I know, and some assumptions that I'm kind of throwing in there, because I like to flesh this out, make these people as much as possible. And you can probably tell, what is a potential embellishment and what I've actually gotten from reading about this guy. I do know that he was raised in Brno, which is, I think, part of the Czechoslovakia is split into Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and I think they're Czechia now. I can't keep track of the names because when it comes up, I think even the people that write stuff online are confused, and so I'll see one name and then the other name. But it was part of Austria then, part of the Austrian Empire, and it was a little town. And the school that was available to kids was at the local monastery. And Gregor went to school and got really excited about math and science and wanted to continue his education, but his family couldn't afford to send him to university. But the monastery could. And the monastery basically said, we will get you a university education if you're willing to come back and be a monk. So that's what he did. He went off and continued his math and science education in sorry, brain is, as I tell people, this is not decorative. And I'm drawing a complete blank on what the capital, Vienna, Austria is. He went to Vienna. And he came back, and it was like, Gregor, really nice to see you, really great to have you here. Is that you've got more training than our previous guy who was teaching in the school, so we'll have you teaching in the school, but we have another job for you. Is that, you see those fields out there? Yeah. Well, as you may know, monasteries don't get a lot of donations. And so most monasteries are financially self-sustaining. They make and sell stuff. The monastery over there is making wine. We're farming. We produce produce. And, brother, Jacques, Johann, see, I'm making that part up. He just passed away, and we don't have anybody to take over these fields over here. And I'm sure Gregor went, so what are we growing in the fields over here? And he went, well, it's pea plants. So we raise those, we sell them at market, and that sustains us with the other brothers, raising their parts of the farm. So Mendel became a teacher and a pea farmer. Now he was a pea farmer for a while. And if you think about it, he had to be a pea farmer for a while because you have to raise these things for a while to make the observations that he made. And what he observed about peas, don't worry about the labels, was there are a number of features in peas that come in either or varieties. Don't come in a whole range. You don't get a whole range between white and purple. You get purple flowers or white flowers. Is that the way that the leaves attach come in those two? I don't know what a between would be on that. You get distinctly yellow or distinctly yellow or distinctly, okay. I should be doing this because I'm pointing with my shadow and that doesn't come across very well on the videos. I'm sorry, I've been doing that. And I realized recently. So yellow or green peas and pods. And rounder wrinkled peas, and the pods came in different colors, but you could get yellow peas in a green pod or green peas in a green pod. Is that what made the peas a certain color, what made the pods a certain color was obviously something different in the peas. And that's what he was interested in. What's making the plants different in these features like height, where you get tall plants or short plants, but as long as you take care of them right, you don't get medium height plants. So, he wasn't dumb. He figured that if you bred peas with these different traits together, that one of the features wasn't completely obliterating the other one because it would have gone away after a while. So, but it seems like maybe one was hiding the other. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. He went, okay, I'm going to try to figure this out. Brothers, I'm subdividing the fields. I'm putting a lot of labels up. I'm going to be out there for a long time. And don't bother my fields. And he did some reading. Now, pea plants, like most flowering plants, are sexually reproducing plants. They are male-female reproducing. Any flower has male parts and female parts. The male parts produce pollen, that's a sperm casing. And the female parts in the base produce egg cells. He didn't know that, but he knew what the male parts and the female parts were. And he learned how to specifically breed one plant with another plant. So they're coming up, and the flowers are forming, but they haven't opened yet. You go individually to each plant, and you pry it open very gently, and you reach in with forceps, and you pluck the male parts, the little things with the knobs on top. Pluck them out, and you put them in an envelope with a little label on the envelope. You turn the fold over. They will mature in the envelope, and to the point where they're producing actual pollen. At the point you're doing this, there's no pollen being made. And then you gently close your flower and you enclose it in cheesecloth. So, it's something that can breathe so it doesn't, mold in there. And also, pollen's not getting in when the flower opens and the female parts mature. And then you go through the whole field and you do this. And so he's breeding tall plants and short plants and short plants, and then he's checking to see, am I getting tall plants? Am I getting tall plants? Eventually, he got a group of plants where he was absolutely positive if he bred just within that group, he would get tall plants, and one where he would get just short plants, and one where you get just purple flowers, and one where you just got white flowers. I don't know how long that takes somebody. I don't know exactly how certain you wind up being, but he did eventually have a plot that bred within the plot always gave him one of the two either or traits. And this is all set up because his question is, if I take tall plant and breed it with a short plant and plant those peas, I know I'm not going to get a medium-sized plant because I don't get those. What am I going to get? Can we clear some of this land out over here so I can have more plots? Sure, Gregor. So that's what he did, is that after he got his all set up going, he bred plants from each of the separate either or plots, and he planted those peas in another plot. Those he knew were hybrids because he had made them hybrids. But they only showed one of the two traits. When he crossed tall and short plants, he only got tall plants. When he planted or crossed purple and white flowers, he only got purple flowers. And it's like, okay, well, what happened to the short? What happened to the white? As I said, if one of them obliterated the other, then it would, over the just random mating, it would, the trait that was obliterated would be obliterated, it'd be gone. So he's thinking, maybe it's hidden. Maybe I can get it to come back out. We need to clear some more land out because I'm going to need some more plots. I'm going to cross my hybrids that I know are hybrids with each other and see what I get. Plant those peas and see what sort of plants I get. So he took his tall, short hybrids, crossed them with each other, planted them, and he did get short back a quarter of the time. When he planted the purple and white flower hybrids together and planted them, he got white back a quarter of the time. That math happened over and over and over again. And based on that, he came up with some concepts. These heritable traits are produced by something in the plant we'll call a gene. It generates the trait. Nobody knew anything about the molecular stuff going on here. But a gene for a trait can come in different forms and produce different variations of the trait: purple, white flowers, tall, short plants. And I'm going to call the variants of the genes alleles, or alleles, people pronounce it both ways. So there'll be an allele for tall and an allele for short. And based on the math he was getting, he figured out that parents have a pair of alleles, but when they reproduce, they only get to send one on to their offspring. So if you got a hybrid, it's either going to send the tall on or the short on. You can't send both. If you've got two talls, you know what they're going to go. You get two shorts, you know it's going to go. And in some mixes, the presence of one allele will hide the presence of the other allele. That's what happens. The tall hides that the short is there. Is that the only way you can get short back is to have two shorts together. The purple hides that the white is there. So I'm going to put some terms down. I just told you what they are. So you may need to back the video up to fill your notes in. The genes produce the traits. The alleles are the variants of the genes. Now he knew that he was looking at some version of genetics that didn't apply to everything, because every single trait in a pea plant doesn't come in an either or variety. Eventually we found out there are traits in people that do that too, but there are a small group of traits. What we now know is that a gene, we've talked about this already, a gene is a DNA code for a particular protein. but the codes do vary, and some of the variants produce different proteins that are functionally different. So the alleles are different codes for the same protein, and very often the codes can be different and the proteins are virtually identical, or the codes can be different and the proteins just do what they're supposed to do. But sometimes a variant code will produce a protein that doesn't really do anything, or it does something very, very weakly. So if you have an allele for a normal functioning protein and an allele for a non-functioning version of that protein, then you'll get the function. You'll produce enough of the functioning protein to get the function to work. But it'll hide the fact that there's a non-working code next to it. Remember, they're in pairs. So you have a working one making enough working protein to be fine, and the non-working one, it's making protein, but that protein's not doing anything. There are situations where an allele will change, and it'll change the function of a protein to do something bad that kind of overwhelms what the proteins do. There are some dominant traits that produce diseases. But most diseases that are genetic are recessive diseases, where you get two codes together that make non-working proteins, and then whatever that protein's doing isn't happening for you. So if you have sickle cell anemia, is that the gene is hemoglobin. You have a normal hemoglobin allele and a sickle cell allele. If you get two sickle cell alleles together, your hemoglobin molecule is round with oxygen stuck on it, but when oxygen comes off of it, it kind of changes shape, and it can actually change the shape of the red blood cells the hemoglobin is in. They become pointy sickle cell, and they don't go through little blood vessels very well. It's a recessive disease because you have to have two sickle alleles. If you have one sickle allele and one regular allele, you do have what's called sickle cell trait because you are making sickle cell hemoglobin, roughly half of what's in your red blood cells. But you have to be in really low oxygen conditions for enough of them to change shape to affect the cells. So typically somebody with sickle cell trait isn't really affected by it because the sickle cell hemoglobin still carries oxygen, still delivers oxygen, but unless you get enough of it, it doesn't mess your cells up. So Mendel writes up papers in Latin, puts his papers out there. If you're a scientist, your method of communication with the world before the internet and before press releases, which has done weird things to science, was to write a paper and put the paper out in journals, and then you knew people were reading it if they built on your stuff. They used you as a reference in their own papers. It's what they call the citation index. People actually track that, and the strength of someone's science often is a high citation index. Mendel didn't have a high citation index. So far as Mendel could tell, nobody was reading his stuff because nobody was using it. I read a historian's article a few years ago, and he had a hypothesis, a theory that if Mendel's stuff was too mathy, is that this stuff, the patterns that you get with dominant recessive, and what happens if you have purple flowers in a tall plant and white flowers in a short plant, and what do you wind up, it is pretty mathy. I will also tell you this. A few years ago, somebody did a study where they published the same papers in comparable journals, and in one of them, they talked about the math, but they put all the actual details of the math at the end. And the other paper, they explained the math as they went along. And it turns out biologists are still not that crazy about math, because the one that was understandable and the math was kind of separate, that one got cited way more than the one where the math was integrated into the explanation. So it wasn't just Mendel a century and a half ago. Biologists are still a little dicey about math. And I'll tell you, that applies to me to some extent as well. So he did a lot of experimenting. He came up with rules, some of which were wonderful, some of which turned out not to work the way that he thought they were going to work. And he published all these papers, and nobody seemed to pay any attention. And he eventually, this is a tough thing to do. Breeding individual pea plants is tough to do. And he eventually apparently got frustrated and just went, I'm not doing this anymore, and he stopped publishing. And eventually he was running the monastery. By the time he died, he was running the monastery. Smart guy. And his papers kind of sat there. And something like 20 years passed. And a couple of researchers in the Netherlands and a couple of researchers in England were interested in the same things. Where do traits come from? Are there patterns that we can recognize in how this works? And like good researchers, they did a literature search. They went through papers on that subject, read a whole bunch of abstracts, and discovered Mendel's work. And we have no way of knowing if they went, oh crap, somebody's already worked this out, or oh great, somebody's done the grunt work. And now we can be trying to figure out why the patterns work the way that they do. But Mendel became the daddy, basically, of genetics, because once this got out there and people started to understand it and work on it, is that, his terminology, the way that he wrote stuff down, all sorts of related stuff that he basically had invented, became the basis of a whole sub-area of biology. So important now that you got to have a genetics class just to do advanced biology. So that's where we're going to stop the history. It was important enough to do Mendel all, separate for himself.